In the grand halls of Kensington Palace, where every footstep echoes with centuries of royal tradition, there exists an unspoken rule that has governed the relationship between the royal family and their protectors for generations. The royal protection officers maintain a respectful distance, their eyes alert but their hands never straying to their weapons unless faced with clear and immediate danger. They are the invisible shield, the silent guardians who blend into the background of royal life. But on one fateful autumn morning in 2023, Senior Protection Officer James Mitchell broke that sacred protocol. For the first time in his 15-year career protecting the royal family, his hand moved instinctively to the grip of his concealed blade, his body tensing like a coiled spring, ready to unleash deadly force. The threat he perceived in that split second would challenge everything he thought he knew about his duty, his loyalty, and the woman he had sworn to protect with his life. Princess Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood frozen in that moment, watching as the man who had become more than just her bodyguard transformed before her eyes into something she had never seen before, a warrior prepared to kill or die for her safety. What happened in the next few minutes would not only test the bonds of trust between a princess and her protector, but would also reveal a conspiracy that threatened to shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. This is the true story of that day, when duty became personal, when protocol became secondary to instinct, and when one man's split-second decision changed the course of royal protection forever. James Mitchell had always believed that the best protection officers were the ones you never noticed. At 38 years old, he had perfected the art of being invisible while remaining constantly vigilant. His colleagues often joked that he could blend into wallpaper, but James knew that his ability to become part of the background was what made him so effective at his job. Standing at 6'2" with an athletic build maintained through rigorous daily training, James possessed the physical presence to handle any threat, yet he moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to prove his capabilities. The morning of October 15, 2023 began like any other day in James's carefully structured routine. He arrived at Kensington Palace at 5:30 in the morning, 2 hours before Princess Catherine was scheduled to wake. His first task, as always, was to review the overnight security reports with the night shift team. The palace had remained secure throughout the night, with only the usual minor incidents. A photographer attempting to climb the perimeter fence around midnight, quickly deterred by the outer security team, and a delivery truck that had taken a wrong turn and lingered too long near the main gates before being redirected. James made his way through the quiet corridors of the palace, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that had been installed not just for luxury, but also to allow the protection team to move silently through the building. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the ornate walls, adorned with centuries of royal portraits. These halls had witnessed countless moments of British history, from intimate family conversations to state decisions that shaped nations. James often reflected on the weight of that history and his small but crucial role in protecting its continuation. In the security office, James began his daily ritual of studying Princess Catherine's schedule. Today was relatively light compared to her usual packed itinerary. She had a private meeting with representatives from her Early Years Foundation at 10 o'clock, followed by a charitable lunch with the Children's Hospital Board at 1:30. The afternoon would be spent reviewing plans for an upcoming trip to Wales, and the evening was reserved for family time with Prince William and their children. It was the kind of day that allowed James to breathe a little easier, though he never allowed his guard to drop completely. What James didn't know was that 3 floors above him, in a room that officially didn't exist on any palace floor plan, a very different kind of morning meeting was taking place. Margaret Thornfield, a woman whose official title is Senior Administrative Coordinator, gave no indication of her true role within the royal household's shadow operations, sat across from a man whose face bore the weathered lines of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions in dark places. The man, known to very few people by his real name of Simon Blackwood, carried the unofficial title of Royal Security Consultant, though his actual job description would have shocked most members of Parliament. "The situation has become untenable," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone born into the upper echelons of British society. "The Princess of Wales has become too independent, too willing to challenge established protocols. Her influence over Prince William continues to grow, and her popularity with the public makes her increasingly difficult to manage." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his cold blue eyes studying the dossier spread across the table between them. The file contained detailed psychological profiles, communication intercepts, and behavioral analysis reports that painted a picture of a royal family member who was becoming increasingly problematic for certain powerful interests within the establishment. "And you're certain that the traditional methods of influence won't be sufficient?" he asked. "We've tried everything," Margaret replied, her frustration evident despite her composed exterior. Leaked stories to the press, manufactured controversies, even attempts to create friction within the family. Nothing sticks. If anything, each challenge seems to make her stronger and more determined. The public sees her as authentic, relatable, and genuinely committed to her charitable work. She's becoming untouchable through conventional means. Blackwood nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the table as he considered the implications. Then we move to more direct measures. But it has to look completely natural. An accident, a random crime, nothing that could ever be traced back to us. The investigation will conclude that it was simply a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. 3 floors below, completely unaware of the conversation that was sealing his fate as much as Princess Catherine's, James continued his morning preparations. He reviewed the background files of every person scheduled to meet with the princess that day, cross-referencing their information with intelligence databases to identify any potential security concerns. It was meticulous work that most people would find tediously boring. But James approached it with the same intensity that a surgeon might bring to studying medical charts before a complex operation. At 7:15, James made his way to the kitchen to review the meal preparations. Food security was a critical component of royal protection that the public rarely considered. Every ingredient was sourced from verified suppliers, every dish was prepared under the watchful eye of security-cleared staff, and nothing reached the royal family's table without passing through multiple layers of inspection. James had developed a good working relationship with the kitchen staff over the years, and they understood that his presence wasn't a reflection of distrust in their abilities, but rather an essential part of the comprehensive security protocol that kept the royal family safe. Mrs. Henderson, the head cook, greeted James with her usual warm smile. She had been working in royal kitchens for over 20 years and had seen protection officers come and go, but she had developed a particular fondness for James due to his respectful demeanour and genuine interest in understanding every aspect of royal household operations. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. The princess requested something light for breakfast this morning, just fresh fruit, yogurt, and her usual tea blend. James nodded, making a mental note to ensure that the fruit had been properly inspected and that the tea came from the sealed containers kept specifically for the royal family. These details might seem paranoid to outsiders, but history was filled with examples of how the most powerful people in the world had been brought down by seemingly innocent consumables. The protection of the royal family required constant vigilance against threats both obvious and subtle. As 8 o'clock approached, James positioned himself outside Princess Catherine's private quarters. This was always his favorite part of the day, the quiet moments before the official schedule began, when the palace still held the peaceful atmosphere of a family home, rather than the bustling center of royal operations it would become within hours. He could hear the distant sounds of the children getting ready for school. Their laughter and chatter reminded that beneath all the protocol and formality, this was ultimately about protecting a family. Princess Catherine emerged from her room at exactly 8:05, a punctuality that James had come to expect and appreciate. She was dressed in a navy blue dress that was both elegant and practical. Her hair pulled back in a style that looked effortless, but had undoubtedly taken considerable time to achieve. What struck James, as it always did, was how she managed to look simultaneously regal and approachable, carrying herself with the dignity befitting her position, while maintaining the warmth that had endeared her to the British public. "Good morning, James," she said, offering him the kind of genuine smile that made his job feel less like duty and more like privilege. "How are Sarah and the children?" This was typical of Princess Catherine, remembering personal details about the people around her, asking questions that showed she saw them as individuals, rather than simply functions within the royal machine. James had been married to Sarah for 12 years, and they had 2 children, Emma, aged 10, and David, aged 7. The princess had met them briefly at a palace family day 2 years earlier, and had somehow retained not just their names, but details about their interests and activities. "They're doing well, thank you for asking, ma'am," James replied. "Emma just started violin lessons, and David has decided he wants to be a marine biologist after watching a documentary about whales."
Princess Catherine laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the corridor around them.
Children have such wonderful certainty about these things, don't they? One day they're going to be marine biologists. The next they want to be astronauts or teachers or professional football players. I hope he maintains that curiosity about the ocean. We need more people who care about protecting our marine environment. As they walked toward the breakfast room, James maintained his usual position, close enough to respond instantly to any threat, but far enough back to give the princess the space and privacy she needed to function normally. He had learned over the years that effective protection wasn't just about physical security, it was about creating an environment where the person being protected could live their life as normally as possible while remaining constantly aware of potential dangers. The breakfast room was one of the more intimate spaces in Kensington Palace, decorated in warm yellows and soft blues that created a welcoming atmosphere far removed from the formal grandeur of the staterooms. Princess Catherine settled into her usual chair, and James took up his customary position near the window, where he could observe both the interior of the room and the gardens outside. The morning light streaming through the windows highlighted the careful attention to detail that went into every aspect of royal life. The precisely arranged flowers, the perfectly polished silverware, the crystal water glasses that caught and reflected the sunlight in tiny rainbows. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a breakfast tray, her movements efficient but unhurried. She had learned long ago that rushing in the presence of royalty was both unnecessary and inappropriate. The royal family, she had discovered, preferred their staff to work with calm competence rather than nervous energy. She set down the fresh fruit, strawberries, blueberries, and sliced mango, arranged with artistic precision, along with a small bowl of Greek yogurt and a pot of the princess's preferred tea blend. "Will there be anything else, Your Royal Highness?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "This looks perfect, thank you," Princess Catherine replied. "Please give my compliments to whoever prepared the fruit. The presentation is beautiful." After Mrs. Easiax Henderson left, Princess Catherine turned to James with a slightly more serious expression. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said, stirring honey into her tea. "I've been getting the feeling lately that something has changed. Not anything specific that I can point to, but just a different atmosphere around the palace. Have you noticed anything unusual?" James felt a slight chill run down his spine. One of the things that made Princess Catherine such an effective royal was her keen intuition about people and situations. If she was sensing something amiss, it was worth taking seriously. "What kind of changes have you noticed, ma'am?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral while his mind began racing through recent events, looking for patterns or anomalies he might have missed. "It's subtle things," she said, taking a sip of her tea. "Conversations that stop when I walk into a room. Staff members who seem unusually nervous around me. Phone calls that get transferred or cut short when I'm nearby. And there have been more security briefings lately. Briefings that I'm not included in, which is unusual." James nodded, filing away each detail while trying to maintain an expression of calm professionalism. The truth was, he had noticed some of the things Princess Catherine was describing, but he had attributed them to the normal ebb and flow of palace politics and seasonal adjustments in security protocols. Now, hearing them compiled into a single narrative, they took on a more ominous significance. "I'll look into it discreetly," James promised. "It could be nothing more than preparation for the upcoming Wales trip, or perhaps some intelligence about increased paparazzi activity that they're trying to manage without causing you additional stress. But you're right to trust your instincts. They've always been excellent." Princess Catherine smiled, but James could see the concern that remained in her eyes. "Thank you. I know I'm probably being overly sensitive, but I'd rather address something that turns out to be nothing than ignore something that could be important." What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, 3 floors above them, final arrangements were being made for events that would test every aspect of James's training, loyalty, and courage. Simon Blackwood was reviewing a detailed plan that had been months in the making, a plan that relied on precision timing, careful manipulation of security protocols, and the assumption that even the most dedicated protection officer would prioritize following orders over following instincts. The morning progressed with deceptive normalcy. Princess Catherine finished her breakfast while discussing her plans for the Early Years Foundation meeting, expressing her excitement about new research on childhood development that could influence policy recommendations. James listened with half his attention, while the other half remained focused on the subtle signs that something was building toward a critical moment. The palace felt different today, though. He couldn't quite identify why. There was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to flow through the staff, a barely perceptible change in the rhythm of daily operations. At 9:30, James escorted Princess Catherine to her office to review materials for her upcoming meetings. The office was a reflection of her personality, professionally appointed but warm and personal, with photographs of her family arranged alongside official documents and charitable reports. She settled behind her desk with the focused attention she brought to all her responsibilities, but James noticed that she seemed more alert than usual, her eyes occasionally moving to the window or the door as if she, too, was sensing the undercurrent of change that had settled over the palace. As 10 o'clock approached, James prepared to escort Princess Catherine to the meeting room where the Early Years Foundation representatives were waiting. It was routine, the kind of short walk through familiar corridors that they had made hundreds of times before. But as they left the office, James felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The primitive warning system that had kept him alive through years of high-risk situations was suddenly screaming that something was very, very wrong. He placed his hand on Princess Catherine's arm, stopping her in the corridor. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'd like you to wait here for just a moment while I check something." Princess Catherine looked at him with surprise, but she had learned to trust James's instincts completely. If he sensed danger, there was danger, even if she couldn't see or understand what it might be. "Of course," she said, stepping back against the wall. James moved forward carefully, his senses hyper-alert to every sound, every shadow, every detail of the familiar corridor that suddenly felt like hostile territory. His hand moved instinctively toward the concealed blade at his side, not drawing it but positioning his fingers for instant access if needed. 15 years of training had taught him that the difference between life and death often came down to fractions of seconds, and those fractions of seconds could only be gained through constant preparation and absolute trust in one's instincts. What he saw as he rounded the corner would change everything he thought he knew about protecting the royal family, and it would force him to make decisions that would define not just his career, but the rest of his life. The corridor ahead of James appeared empty at first glance, but his trained eye immediately identified what was wrong. The morning light filtering through the tall windows cast shadows in patterns he knew by heart, and today those patterns were different. Someone had moved the antique side table that normally stood against the wall near the meeting room entrance. It was a subtle change that most people would never notice, but James had spent years memorizing every detail of these hallways, understanding that survival often depended on recognizing when something was out of place. More concerning was what he heard, or rather, what he didn't hear. The meeting room should have contained the quiet murmur of conversation as the early years Foundation representatives prepared for their session with Princess Catherine. Instead, there was complete silence. In 15 years of escorting royals to meetings, James had never encountered a room full of people waiting in absolute quiet. People talked, shuffled papers, checked their phones, cleared their throats. They made the small sounds of human presence that became background noise in any gathering. James felt his pulse quicken as he approached the meeting room door, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. His hand moved closer to his concealed weapon, fingers flexing in preparation for what his instincts were telling him was an imminent threat. Through the partially open door, he could see into the room, and what he observed made his blood run cold. The early years Foundation representatives were there, but they were not behaving like people preparing for a routine meeting with royalty. Instead of the respectful attention and nervous anticipation he would have expected, they sat in unnaturally rigid positions, their faces pale and strained. At the head of the table sat a man James had never seen before, a lean, sharp-featured individual in an expensive suit, whose presence immediately set off every alarm in James's protective instincts. The stranger was speaking in low, measured tones to the assembled group, and although James could not make out the exact words, the tone was unmistakably threatening. The Foundation representatives were not willing participants in whatever was happening in that room. They were hostages, controlled through fear and intimidation into participating in something that went far beyond a charitable meeting. James's mind raced through possibilities and protocols, but none of his training had prepared him for a situation where the threat came from within the palace itself, using legitimate appointments as cover for hostile operations. His first instinct was to radio for backup, but something held him back. If this was an internal operation, how could he be certain that his communications wouldn't be intercepted or that backup wouldn't arrive with instructions to stand down rather than protect Princess Catherine? Moving silently back toward where Princess Catherine waited, James felt the weight of 15 years of service pressing down on him. Every decision he had made as a protection officer had been guided by clear protocols and chain-of-command structures that left little room for individual interpretation. But now he faced a situation where following protocol might mean delivering Princess Catherine directly into the hands of people who intended to harm her, while breaking protocol might mean ending his career and potentially facing criminal charges for insubordination. Princess Catherine was still standing against the wall where he had left her, but her expression had shifted from patient cooperation to genuine concern. She could read the tension in James's posture, the careful way he moved, the subtle signs that indicated he was operating in crisis mode despite the apparent normalcy of their surroundings. "James, what's happening?" she asked quietly, keeping her voice low instinctively. "The meeting room situation is not what it should be," James replied, choosing his words carefully. "I need you to trust me completely right now, ma'am, and do exactly what I tell you, without asking questions or hesitating. Can you do that?" Princess Catherine nodded immediately. She had worked with protection officers long enough to understand that when they shifted into emergency protocols, questions and delays could be deadly. Yes, of course. We're going to walk back toward your office, but we're going to take the long route through the East Corridor, James said, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Stay close to me, match my pace exactly, and if I tell you to run or hide, do it immediately without looking back or trying to help me. They began moving through the palace corridors, but James quickly realized that their situation was more precarious than he had initially understood. As they walked, he noticed other subtle signs that the palace's normal operations had been compromised. Staff members who should have been at their posts were absent. Doors that were normally open stood closed. The usual background sounds of palace life, distant conversations, footsteps, the hum of activity that indicated a living, working building, had been replaced by an unnatural quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. More troubling still, James began to spot individuals he didn't recognize in positions throughout the palace. They were dressed appropriately and carried themselves with professional bearing, but James knew every person who had legitimate access to Princess Catherine's living and working spaces. These were strangers, and their presence meant that whatever was happening had been planned with meticulous attention to detail and significant resources. As they rounded a corner near the library, James came face to face with a situation that confirmed his worst fears. Two men in security uniforms were stationed at the end of the corridor, but these were not palace security personnel. James recognized the type immediately: military contractors, probably former special forces, the kind of professionals who worked in the grey areas where governments needed operations that couldn't officially exist. The men saw James and Princess Catherine at the same moment James spotted them. For a fraction of a second, everyone froze, and James felt time slow down in the way it always did when violence became inevitable. His hand moved to his blade, not drawing it yet but making it clear that he was prepared to use it. The contractors' hands moved toward their concealed weapons, professional instinct overriding any attempt at maintaining their cover. "Ma'am," James said quietly, never taking his eyes off the two men, "I need you to walk backward very slowly until you reach the alcove behind us, then wait for my signal." Princess Catherine began moving as instructed, her trust in James absolute despite the terror that was beginning to build in her chest. She had never seen him like this, every muscle tensed, his entire body radiating the controlled aggression of a predator preparing to fight for survival. This was a side of her protection officer that she had never imagined, the lethal capabilities that lay beneath his quiet professionalism. The lead contractor took a step forward, his hand now resting openly on his weapon. "Mr. Mitchell," he said in a voice that carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, "you need to bring Princess Catherine to the meeting room immediately. Those are your orders." "I don't take orders from people I don't know," James replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "And I need to see proper identification before we go anywhere." The second contractor spoke up, his tone more threatening than his partner's. "Your orders come from much higher up the chain than you're used to dealing with, Mitchell. This is a matter of national security, and your cooperation is not optional." James felt the familiar clarity that came with absolute certainty about what needed to be done. These men were professionals, well-trained and well-equipped, but they had made a critical error in assuming that he would follow orders simply because they were delivered with authority. 15 years of protecting the royal family had taught him that his ultimate loyalty was not to any chain of command, but to the specific individuals he had sworn to protect. "My orders," James said, his hand now gripping his blade handle, "are to protect Princess Catherine from all threats, foreign and domestic. Right now you're looking like a threat." The tension in the corridor reached a breaking point, as all three men realized that violence was now unavoidable. James had positioned himself between the contractors and Princess Catherine, but he was outnumbered and likely outgunned. His only advantages were his intimate knowledge of the palace layout and his absolute commitment to protecting Princess Catherine, regardless of the cost to himself. The lead contractor made the first move, reaching for his weapon with professional speed and precision. But James had been anticipating the moment for the past several minutes, and his blade was already clearing its concealed sheath, before the contractor's gun was halfway out of its holster. The steel caught the morning light streaming through the corridor windows, its polished surface reflecting James's determined face as he stepped forward to meet the attack. Princess Catherine, pressed back in the alcove, watched in shock as the man who had quietly accompanied her to countless routine engagements transformed into someone she had never seen before. This was James Mitchell as a warrior, not just a protector, and the controlled violence of his movements was both terrifying and magnificent to witness. The blade struck the first contractor's wrist with surgical precision, causing him to drop his partially drawn weapon as blood spread across his shirt sleeve. James followed through with an elbow strike to the man's solar plexus, dropping him to the corridor floor, gasping for breath. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, but the second contractor was already moving, his weapon now fully drawn and aimed at James's center mass. Time seemed to freeze as James realized that his blade, no matter how skillfully wielded, could not cover the distance between him and the second gunman before a trigger could be pulled. He had succeeded in neutralizing one threat, but at the cost of exposing himself to another. In that moment, facing the barrel of a gun held by a professional killer, James felt not fear for himself but a devastating sense of failure. He had sworn to protect Princess Catherine, and he was about to die before fulfilling that oath. But Princess Catherine, watching from the alcove, was not the helpless victim that the contractors had expected. Years of royal duty had taught her to remain calm under pressure, and her charitable work had brought her into contact with enough dangerous situations to understand that survival sometimes required split-second decision-making. As the second contractor aimed at James, she grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the alcove's decorative table and hurled it at the gunman's head with all the force she could muster. The vase struck the contractor in the temple, not enough to seriously injure him, but sufficient to spoil his aim and give James the opening he needed. The protection officer lunged forward, closing the distance before the gunman could recover his targeting. James's blade found its mark, sliding between ribs with the precision that came from years of training in techniques that were never supposed to be used but had to be perfected nonetheless. The second contractor collapsed, his weapon clattering across the marble floor. As James rolled away and came up in a defensive crouch, his blade ready for additional threats. The corridor was suddenly quiet, except for the labored breathing of the wounded men and the sound of James's heart pounding in his ears. Princess Catherine emerged from the alcove, her face pale but her composure intact. "James, are you injured?" "I'm fine, ma'am," James replied, though his voice carried a tremor that he couldn't quite suppress. "But we need to move immediately. If they sent 2 men here, there are more positioned throughout the palace." As if to confirm his assessment, the sound of footsteps echoed from multiple directions, indicating that other teams were converging on their location. James grabbed the dropped weapons, checking their ammunition and safety mechanisms with practiced efficiency. He had hoped never to use such weapons in the course of protecting the royal family, but circumstances had moved far beyond normal protective protocols. "Can you use one of these if necessary?" James asked, offering Princess Catherine one of the smaller pistols. She looked at the weapon with obvious reluctance, but took it without hesitation. "I've had some training," she said. "Skeet shooting with my father, and William insisted I learn basic firearm safety after we married. I'm not expert, but I can point and pull the trigger if I have to." James nodded, impressed by her practical response to their desperate situation. "Stay behind me, keep the weapon pointed at the ground unless you need to use it. And remember that our goal is to get out of the palace and to a secure location where we can contact people we trust." They began moving through the corridors again, but now their progress was measured in careful advances from cover to cover. James's knowledge of the palace layout became their primary advantage, as he led Princess Catherine through service passages and secondary corridors that most people, including hostile forces, wouldn't know existed. But he also knew that their time was limited. Eventually, the superior numbers and resources of their enemies would overcome the advantages of familiarity and defensive positioning. As they moved deeper into the palace's less public areas, James began to piece together the scope of what they were facing. This was not a random attack or a crime of opportunity. The level of planning, the quality of personnel, the knowledge of palace operations, all of it pointed to an operation that had been months or even years in the making. Someone with access to the highest levels of intelligence about royal security had planned this operation, and they had resources that suggested backing from powerful interests within the British establishment itself. The realization filled James with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. He had spent his entire adult life serving his country and protecting its most important symbols, and now he discovered that elements within that same system were willing to kill the people he had sworn to protect. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, transforming his protective instincts into something harder and more dangerous. They reached a service stairway that would take them down to the lower levels of the palace, where James hoped they could access the tunnel systems that connected Kensington Palace to other government buildings. If they could reach those tunnels, they might be able to get to the secure communications facility beneath the Foreign Office, where James could contact people he trusted within the intelligence services. But as they began descending the stairs, they heard voices echoing from below. More contractors, systematically searching the building and closing off their escape routes with military precision. James realized that whoever had planned this operation understood the palace's security procedures well enough to anticipate every move he might make. They were not just being hunted, they were being herded toward a specific location where the operation could be completed according to plan. Standing on the stairway landing, surrounded by the sounds of systematic searches above and below them, James made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of continuing to react to his enemies' moves, he would take the initiative and force them to respond to his actions. If they wanted to capture or kill Princess Catherine, they would have to come through him. And he was prepared to make that as costly as possible. "Ma'am," he said, turning to face Princess Catherine with an expression that mixed grim determination with something that looked almost like an apology. "I'm afraid our situation has become much worse than I initially thought. We're facing a coordinated operation with significant resources and inside knowledge of our security procedures. If we continue trying to escape through normal routes, we're going to walk into another trap." Princess Catherine nodded, her fear visible but controlled. "What do you recommend?" James looked at her with growing respect for her calm competence under pressure. "We're going to have to fight our way out, ma'am, and that's going to require me to do things that are going to be difficult to watch. Are you prepared for that?" "James," Princess Catherine said firmly, "I trust you completely. Do whatever you need to do to keep us alive." With that endorsement, James Mitchell, Senior Protection Officer to the Princess of Wales, prepared to wage a war within the walls of Kensington Palace. His hand tightened on his blade as he heard footsteps approaching from both directions, and for the first time in his career, he prepared to kill not to protect his country, but to protect it from itself. The sound of approaching footsteps from both directions confirmed James's worst assessment. They were trapped in a carefully orchestrated pincer movement. But rather than wait passively for their enemies to close the trap, James decided to use the confined space of the stairwell to his advantage. In close quarters, superior numbers meant less than superior positioning and the willingness to use maximum violence without hesitation. "Ma'am, I need you to go back up to the landing above us and take cover behind that marble pillar," James instructed, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "If anyone comes up those stairs who isn't me, shoot them. Don't hesitate, don't warn them, just shoot." Princess Catherine moved as instructed, her royal training in maintaining composure under pressure, serving her well in circumstances no amount of protocol preparation could have anticipated. She positioned herself behind the pillar, with the pistol ready, her hands steadier than James had expected. The woman who smiled graciously at charity events and delivered thoughtful speeches about childhood development was revealing an inner strength that explained why she had succeeded so completely in her royal role despite its enormous pressures. James positioned himself on the stairway where the narrow confines would force any attackers to come at him, one or two at a time, rather than using their numerical advantage. His blade felt perfectly balanced in his hand, its familiar weight a comfort in the chaos that was about to unfold. 15 years of training had prepared him for this moment, even though he had hoped never to face it. The first contractor appeared from below, moving with the cautious precision of a professional who understood that his target was armed and dangerous. James waited until the man was committed to the stairway, unable to retreat quickly, before launching his attack. The blade struck with surgical precision, finding the gap between body armor plates that most people didn't even know existed. The contractor dropped his weapon and collapsed, his surprised expression suggesting that he had underestimated the lethality of a protection officer pushed beyond his normal parameters. The second contractor, hearing his partner fall, approached more cautiously but still had to navigate the same tactical disadvantage of the narrow stairway. James had repositioned himself behind the corner, using the stone architecture as cover while maintaining a clear attack angle. When the second man appeared, weapon raised and ready, James was already moving. The blade swept across the contractor's wrist, severing tendons and causing him to drop his gun, followed immediately by a thrust that ended the threat permanently. From above, Princess Catherine watched with a mixture of horror and admiration as James moved through the violence with an efficiency that was almost artistic in its precision. This was a side of human capability that her sheltered royal existence had never exposed her to, the capacity for controlled, purposeful killing that lay beneath civilization's veneer. She understood now why protection officers underwent such rigorous psychological evaluation. They had to be capable of transitioning instantly from quiet professionalism to lethal action when circumstances demanded it. Two more contractors appeared from the upper level, forcing James to fight on two fronts simultaneously. These men had learned from their colleagues' fate and approached with greater caution, but they were still constrained by the architecture that turned their numerical advantage into a tactical disadvantage. James moved between them like a dancer. His blade worked precise and economical, each strike designed to eliminate threats with minimum expenditure of energy. Princess Catherine found herself forced into action when one of the contractors attempted to circle around James's position. Following James's instructions exactly, she aimed and fired without warning or hesitation. The shot took the contractor in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering down the stairs. The sound of the gunshot in the confined space was deafening, and Princess Catherine felt the shock of having deliberately harmed another human being. But she also felt a grim satisfaction that she had protected the man who was risking everything to protect her. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but when it was over, the stairwell was silent except for their breathing and the distant sounds of more search teams moving through other parts of the palace. James quickly collected weapons and ammunition from the fallen contractors, distributing them efficiently while checking Princess Catherine for injuries or signs of shock. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked, his professional concern overriding the adrenaline that was still coursing through his system. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice carried a slight tremor. "James, how many more of them are there?" "Too many to fight our way through using conventional tactics," James admitted. "But I have an idea that might give us better odds." James had realized that their enemy's superior numbers and coordination came from their ability to communicate and coordinate their movements throughout the palace. If he could disrupt those communications while simultaneously creating enough chaos to mask their movements, they might be able to reach one of the secure communication points where he could call for legitimate backup. Leading Princess Catherine through service corridors that few people knew existed, James made his way toward the palace's central utility areas. His plan was risky and would require precise timing, but it offered their best chance of survival against overwhelming odds. The utility areas contained the main electrical distribution panels for the palace, and James knew that a carefully planned power failure could provide the cover they needed, while simultaneously disrupting the contractors' communication networks. "What exactly are you planning?" Princess Catherine asked as they moved through narrow passages lined with pipes and electrical conduits. "I'm going to cut power to most of the palace," James explained. "That will force them to operate in darkness while we use emergency lighting systems that they probably don't know about. More importantly, it will shut down their communication equipment long enough for us to reach the secure phone system in the basement communications room." They reached the main electrical panel, a complex array of switches and circuit breakers that controlled power distribution throughout Kensington Palace. James had studied these systems as part of his comprehensive security training, understanding that protecting the royal family required knowledge of every aspect of the building they inhabited. Now that knowledge would serve a purpose he had never anticipated. "Ma'am, when I throw these switches, we're going to have about 30 seconds before the emergency lighting comes on," James said. "I need you to follow me exactly, no matter how confusing the darkness becomes. Can you do that?" "Yes," Princess Catherine replied with the steady confidence that had characterized her response to every crisis they had faced. James threw the main breakers, plunging most of Kensington Palace into complete darkness. The sudden silence that followed the shutdown of electrical systems was eerie, broken only by distant shouts of confusion from the search teams who had been depending on modern communication equipment to coordinate their efforts. James activated a small emergency light that he carried as part of his standard equipment, providing just enough illumination to navigate the familiar corridors without alerting their enemies to their location. Moving through the darkened palace felt like traveling through a different world. The grand corridors and elegant rooms that normally radiated royal dignity and historical significance became an alien landscape of shadows and unexpected obstacles. Princess Catherine stayed close behind James, her hand on his shoulder to maintain contact in the darkness. Her trust in his guidance absolute despite the terrifying uncertainty of their situation. They encountered their first search team near the portrait gallery, where the contractors were using flashlights to sweep the area systematically. James could hear their frustrated communications as they tried to coordinate without their electronic equipment, reduced to shouting across rooms to maintain contact with other teams. The chaos he had created was working, but it also meant that their enemies were becoming more desperate and potentially more dangerous. James led Princess Catherine around the search team using his intimate knowledge of the palace layout, guiding her through servants' passages that paralleled the main corridors. But as they approached the basement levels, where the secure communications equipment was located, they encountered a problem that James had not anticipated. The contractors had stationed guards at all the main access points to the lower levels, and these guards were using battery-powered equipment that was unaffected by the power outage. "We have a problem," James whispered to Princess Catherine as they observed the guards through a service window. They've blocked all the obvious routes to the communications room. Is there another way? She asked. James considered their options, his mind racing through blueprints and building schematics he had memorized over years of service. There was one possibility, a maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the palace foundations. Originally built in the Victorian era for heating and water systems, the tunnel was narrow, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous, but it would allow them to bypass the guards and reach the communications room from an unexpected direction. There is one route, James said, but it's going to be unpleasant. We'll have to crawl through maintenance tunnels that are barely large enough for adults. Are you willing to do that? Princess Catherine looked at him with determination that reminded James why she had been so successful in her royal role despite all its challenges. James, at this point I would crawl through a sewer if it meant getting us out of this situation safely. They accessed the maintenance tunnel through a concealed panel in the basement utility room, dropping down into a narrow stone passage that smelled of damp earth and old machinery. The tunnel was indeed barely large enough for adults, forcing them to move in a hands-and-knees crawl that was both physically demanding and psychologically claustrophobic. Princess Catherine followed James without complaint, her royal dignity intact even as she crawled through spaces that no member of the royal family had ever been expected to navigate. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly through the darkness, with only James's emergency light to show them the rough stone walls and occasional obstacles that had to be carefully navigated. Princess Catherine's expensive dress was quickly ruined by the dust and grime, but she showed no concern for such trivial matters when their lives depended on reaching their destination. James found himself impressed once again by her practical response to crisis. She understood instinctively that survival required abandoning any concern for comfort or appearance. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached a vertical shaft that led up to the basement communications room. James climbed up first, his blade ready in case they encountered guards, but the room appeared to be empty. The contractors had apparently assumed that the power outage would make the communications equipment useless, not realizing that the secure phone system operated on an independent power supply designed to function during exactly this type of emergency. James helped Princess Catherine up from the tunnel, and they found themselves in a small, windowless room filled with sophisticated communication equipment that most people would never know existed. This was one of the nerve centers of British intelligence operations, disguised as a simple basement storage area, but actually containing direct communication links to MI5, MI6, the Metropolitan Police, and the Prime Minister's crisis management team. "Who are you going to call?" Princess Catherine asked, as James began activating the secure phone system. "The one person I trust completely to handle this situation properly," James replied, dialing a number he had memorized but hoped never to use. "My former commanding officer from the SAS. If anyone can sort out who's legitimate and who's not in this mess, it's Colonel Patricia Hayes." The phone rang twice before a crisp, authoritative voice answered. "Hayes. Colonel, this is James Mitchell, formerly of 22 SAS, currently serving as Senior Protection Officer to Princess Catherine. I have a code black situation at Kensington Palace and need immediate assistance from personnel I can trust completely." There was a brief pause before Colonel Hayes responded, her voice shifting to the tone she used for operational emergencies. "James, I've been expecting a call like this. We've been tracking unusual intelligence activity around the royal family for the past several weeks. Where are you now, and what's your immediate situation?" James quickly briefed Colonel Hayes on the attack, the hostile contractors throughout the palace, and their current location in the secure communications room. He could hear her typing rapidly as she processed the information and began coordinating a response. "James, I'm dispatching a full SAS counter-terrorist team to your location, but they won't arrive for at least 20 minutes, Colonel Hayes said. "Can you hold your position that long?" "We'll have to," James replied. "But, Colonel, there's something else you need to know. This operation has inside knowledge of our security procedures and access to intelligence that suggests high-level involvement. We can't trust normal chains of command until we know who's involved." "Understood. James, I want you to know that Princess Catherine's safety is now our highest priority. Hold your position, trust no one except the team I'm sending, and remember that your authority to protect her by any means necessary is absolute." As James ended the call, they heard sounds in the corridor outside the communications room that indicated the contractors had discovered their location. The final confrontation was about to begin, and James prepared himself for the fight that would determine whether they survived the next 20 minutes. His hand moved to his blade one more time, and he prepared to discover just how far he was willing to go to fulfill his oath to protect Princess Catherine with his life. The sounds in the corridor outside the communications room grew louder and more organized. indicating that the contractors had regrouped and were preparing for a coordinated assault on their position. James quickly assessed their defensive situation, noting both advantages and vulnerabilities. The communications room had only one entrance, which made it easier to defend, but also meant they had no escape route if their position was overrun. The thick stone walls would provide good protection against small arms fire, but the room's small size meant they would be fighting at close quarters, where superior numbers could quickly overwhelm even the most skilled defender. "Ma'am, I need you to position yourself behind that bank of equipment in the far corner," James instructed, pointing to a massive array of communication devices that would provide both cover and concealment. "Keep your weapon ready, but don't fire unless someone gets past me and threatens you directly. Your job is to survive, not to help me fight." Princess Catherine moved to the indicated position, but her expression made it clear that she disagreed with the passive role James was assigning her. "James, I'm not going to hide in the corner while you fight alone against impossible odds. I can handle a weapon, and you need all the help you can get." "Ma'am, with respect, my job is to protect you, not to turn you into a combatant," James replied firmly. "The best way you can help is to stay alive, so that when the SAS team arrives, there's still someone to rescue." Before Princess Catherine could argue further, the attack began. The door to the communications room exploded inward in a shower of splinters and metal, as the contractors used explosive charges to breach their defenses. James was already moving, using the confusion and smoke from the explosion to position himself where he could engage the attackers as they came through the doorway. The first contractor through the breach found himself facing James's blade before he could fully orient himself to the room's layout. The protection officer's strike was precise and lethal, dropping the attacker instantly. But the next two contractors came through simultaneously, forcing James to divide his attention and fight on multiple fronts at the same time. The confined space of the communications room became a deadly arena, where every piece of furniture, every equipment rack, every surface became either cover or weapon, depending on how it was used. James moved through the chaos with fluid grace, his years of training evident in every movement. But he was facing professional killers who were equally well-trained and who had the advantage of numbers and superior firepower. One contractor managed to get behind James's initial defensive position, forcing the protection officer to spin and engage, while simultaneously tracking the movements of two other attackers. His blade work was magnificent, precise, economical, devastatingly effective, but even the most skilled fighter could not indefinitely hold off multiple opponents in a confined space. Princess Catherine, watching from her concealed position, realized that James's noble attempt to fight alone was going to get them both killed. Despite his instructions, she began moving to a position where she could provide supporting fire without exposing herself unnecessarily. Her royal training in maintaining composure under pressure served her well as she calculated angles and timing, preparing to intervene at the moment when her assistance would be most effective. The moment came when one of the contractors managed to get a clear shot at James, who was engaged with two other attackers and unable to take evasive action. Princess Catherine's shot took the gunman in the chest, spoiling his aim and giving James the opening he needed to eliminate the immediate threat. The protection officer flashed her a quick look of gratitude mixed with exasperation at her disobedience of his orders. "I told you to stay in cover," James said as he engaged the next wave of attackers. "I told you I wasn't going to hide while you fought alone," Princess Catherine replied, reloading her weapon with surprising competence. The battle continued with desperate intensity as more contractors poured into the communications room. James and Princess Catherine found themselves fighting back-to-back, their different combat styles complementing each other in ways that neither had expected. James's blade work was close-quarters artistry, while Princess Catherine's shooting was methodical and effective, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed. But despite their effectiveness as a fighting team, the numbers were increasingly against them. For every attacker they eliminated, two more seemed to take his place. James's blade was red with blood, and Princess Catherine's ammunition was running dangerously low. The communications equipment around them sparked and smoked from bullet impacts, and the air grew thick with gun smoke and the metallic smell of violence. James realized that they were losing the battle of attrition. His protective instincts demanded that he find a way to get Princess Catherine to safety, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. But before he could implement any desperate last-resort plan, the sounds of battle changed dramatically. From the corridor outside came the distinctive sound of flashbang grenades and automatic weapons fire. But this was different from the weapons the contractors had been using. James recognized the particular sound signature of British military equipment, and more importantly, he recognized the tactical patterns of SAS assault techniques. "Stay down," James shouted to Princess Catherine, as the sounds of battle moved closer to their position. "The cavalry has arrived," The SAS counter-terrorist team moved through Kensington Palace like a force of nature, their black-clad figures flowing through corridors with the fluid precision that made them the most feared special operations unit in the world. They had trained for this exact scenario. Hostile forces within government buildings, innocent civilians to be protected, enemies who might be using official cover to mask their operations. Colonel Patricia Hayes personally led the assault team, her presence indicating the highest possible priority for the mission. She moved through the palace with the confidence of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of close-quarters battle, her weapons steady and her commands crisp and clear. Hostile contact, second floor, east wing. Came the radio reports as the SAS team systematically cleared the palace room by room. Multiple enemy KIA, no friendly casualties. The contractors, despite their professional training, found themselves completely outmatched by operators who represented the pinnacle of military excellence. The SAS team's night vision equipment, superior tactics, and absolute commitment to their mission created an overwhelming advantage that the contractors could not counter effectively. In the communications room, James and Princess Catherine heard the battle moving through the palace above them, the sounds of gunfire gradually diminishing as the SAS team eliminated resistance. James remained alert and ready, his blade still in his hand, until he heard the distinctive knock pattern that Colonel Hayes had used during their CES service together. "James, it's Patricia. Are you and Princess Catherine secure?" "We're here, Colonel. Both alive and uninjured," James replied, finally allowing himself to relax slightly for the first time in hours. Colonel Hayes entered the communications room with 3 other SAS operators, their black tactical gear and professional demeanor a reassuring presence after the chaos of the battle. She quickly assessed the room, noting the bodies of the contractors and the defensive positions that James and Princess Catherine had been holding. "Impressive work," Colonel Hayes said, addressing both James and Princess Catherine. "You held off a superior force in a confined space for nearly 20 minutes. That's exceptional performance under any circumstances." Princess Catherine, still holding her weapon but visibly exhausted from the stress and adrenaline of combat, looked around the destroyed communications room with something approaching disbelief. "Is it over?" she asked. "The immediate threat has been eliminated," Colonel Hayes confirmed. "We've secured the palace and taken several contractors alive for interrogation. But ma'am, I have to tell you that this was only the operational level of a much larger conspiracy. The people who planned this attack have resources and connections that go very high up in the British establishment." James felt a cold fury building in his chest as the implications became clear. "How high up, Colonel?" "We're still investigating, but the initial evidence suggests involvement from elements within the Cabinet Office, possibly reaching into the intelligence services themselves," Colonel Hayes replied grimly. "This wasn't just an attack on Princess Catherine personally. It was an attack on the constitutional monarchy itself, planned by people who saw her influence as a threat to their interests." Princess Catherine sat down heavily on an overturned equipment case, the full magnitude of the betrayal beginning to sink in. "My own government tried to kill me?"
"Not your government, ma'am," Colonel Hayes corrected.
"A conspiracy within the government, people who put their personal power above their duty to the Crown and the Constitution. But I want you to know that they represent a small minority. The vast majority of people serving in government positions are loyal and would be horrified by what happened here today." James helped Princess Catherine to her feet, his protective instincts still on high alert despite the apparent end to the immediate danger. "What happens now, Colonel?" "Now we begin the process of identifying everyone involved in this conspiracy and bringing them to justice," Colonel Hayes said. "But that's going to take time. And during that time, Princess Catherine will need protection from people who can be trusted absolutely. James, I'm offering you a temporary assignment to a special protection unit that reports directly to me. Are you interested?" James looked at Princess Catherine, seeing in her eyes the trust that had developed between them during their shared ordeal. "Ma'am, if you're comfortable with the arrangement, I'd be honored to continue protecting you during this investigation." "James," Princess Catherine said with a slight smile that was the first genuine expression of happiness he had seen from her all day. "After what we've been through together, I can't imagine trusting my safety to anyone else." As they prepared to leave the communications room, James reflected on how completely his life had changed in the course of a single day. He had begun the morning as a quiet, professional protection officer whose primary concern was maintaining proper protocol during routine royal engagements. He was ending the day as someone who had killed in defense of the crown, fought alongside a princess, and discovered that his true loyalty lay not to abstract concepts of duty and chain of command, but to the specific human beings he had sworn to protect. The walk through the palace corridors revealed the full scope of the battle that had taken place. Bullet holes in priceless artwork, overturned furniture, bloodstains on carpets that had witnessed centuries of British history. Kensington Palace bore the scars of a war that most people would never know had been fought. But as they emerged into the daylight outside the palace, James felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with victory in battle. He had discovered something about himself during the crisis, that when everything else fell away, when protocol and procedure and chain of command all became meaningless, his core identity was as a protector of people who deserved protection. Princess Catherine had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person worth protecting, and he was prepared to continue that protection for as long as she needed it. The investigation that would follow would expose a conspiracy that reached shocking levels within the British establishment. But that was a battle for lawyers and investigators and politicians. James Mitchell's battle had been simpler and more personal. The fight to keep one good person safe in a world where powerful people were willing to kill to maintain their power. As they walked toward the armored vehicles that would take them to a secure location, Princess Catherine placed her hand briefly on James's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." James nodded, understanding that something had changed permanently between them during their shared ordeal. They were no longer simply a royal and her protection officer. They had become partners in survival, allies in a fight against people who would corrupt the very institutions they were sworn to serve. The real test of that partnership was about to begin, as they faced the challenge of navigating a world where they could trust no one but each other. 3 months after the attack at Kensington Palace, James Mitchell stood in a secure briefing room beneath the Ministry of Defence, listening to Colonel Patricia Hayes deliver the final report on what had become known within intelligence circles as Operation Raven's Nest. The investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached deeper into the British establishment than anyone had initially suspected, revealing a network of individuals who had been systematically working to manipulate royal family dynamics for their own political and financial gain. The conspiracy involved 12 individuals across 4 different government departments. Colonel Hayes reported to the assembled group of senior officials, intelligence officers, and legal representatives. At its center was Margaret Thornfield, who used her position as senior administrative coordinator to the royal household to gather intelligence and coordinate operations. Her co-conspirator, Simon Blackwood, recruited and managed the operational personnel from his network of private military contractors. James found himself thinking about the woman who had served tea and smiled pleasantly during countless royal engagements, all while planning the murder of the person she was supposed to serve. The betrayal still felt personal, even though he understood intellectually that Thornfield's loyalty had never been to Princess Catherine or the royal family, but to abstract concepts of power and control that had corrupted her judgment completely. The motive appears to have been Princess Catherine's growing influence over charitable policy and her increasing independence from traditional royal protocol, Colonel Hayes continued. Certain elements within the establishment viewed her popularity and effectiveness as a threat to established power structures. They believed that eliminating her would restore what they considered proper balance within the royal family hierarchy. Princess Catherine sat beside James during the briefing, her expression composed but her eyes reflecting the profound sadness that came from discovering how many people she had trusted were actually working against her. The past 3 months had been difficult for her in ways that went far beyond the physical danger they had faced. Learning that her own staff, people she had worked with daily and considered friends, had been reporting her activities and planning her death had shaken her faith in human nature in ways that would take years to fully heal. "What about the Early Years Foundation representatives who were in that meeting room?" Princess Catherine asked. "Were they involved, or were they victims too?" "They were victims, ma'am," Colonel Hayes replied. Each of them had been threatened with harm to their families if they didn't cooperate with what they were told was a routine security exercise. They genuinely believed they were helping to test palace security procedures, not participating in an assassination attempt. James felt some relief at this news. He had been haunted by the thought that the charitable work Princess Catherine cared so much about had been corrupted by the conspiracy. Knowing that the Foundation representatives were innocent victims rather than willing participants helped restore some of his faith in the fundamental goodness of the people Princess Catherine worked with. The briefing continued with details about legal proceedings, security reforms, and changes in personnel throughout the royal household. But James found his attention drifting to larger questions about loyalty, duty, and the nature of service in a constitutional monarchy. The attack had forced him to confront the difference between serving an institution and serving the people who embodied that institution's best values. After the formal briefing concluded, James and Princess Catherine walked through St. James's Park, accompanied by a discreet security detail that maintained sufficient distance to allow for private conversation. The park was beautiful in the late spring sunshine, with flowering trees and the peaceful presence of waterfowl on the lake creating an atmosphere of tranquility that seemed almost surreal after the violence and betrayal they had experienced. "I've been thinking about what Colonel Hayes said about my independence being seen as threatening," Princess Catherine said as they walked along the tree-lined path. "It makes me wonder if I should have been more careful, more willing to follow traditional protocols instead of trying to innovate and modernize." James stopped walking and turned to face her with an expression of gentle but firm disagreement. "Ma'am, with respect, that's exactly the wrong lesson to take from this experience. The people who tried to kill you weren't motivated by legitimate concern for royal tradition. They were motivated by their own desire to maintain power and control. Your independence and effectiveness were threats to them personally, not to the monarchy as an institution. But maybe if I had been more conventional, more willing to simply follow established procedures without questioning them, none of this would have happened," Princess Catherine persisted. "Maybe the attack was partially my fault for pushing too hard against traditional boundaries." James felt a surge of protective anger on her behalf. Not the professional protectiveness that came with his job, but the personal indignation of someone who had witnessed her courage and integrity under the most extreme circumstances. "Ma'am, I watched you crawl through maintenance tunnels without complaint, fight back-to-back with me against professional killers, and maintain your composure through situations that would have broken most people. You've proven yourself in ways that go far beyond royal protocol or public expectations. The conspiracy against you wasn't about your methods, it was about your effectiveness." They continued walking. But James could see that Princess Catherine was still struggling with questions about her role and responsibilities. The attack had changed her in fundamental ways, forcing her to confront the reality that her position made her a target for people who saw her influence as threatening to their interests. The weight of that knowledge was visible in the way she carried herself, more alert and cautious than before, but also somehow more determined. "James, there's something I need to tell you," Princess Catherine said after they had walked in comfortable silence for several minutes. "I've been offered the opportunity to step back from public duties, to take on a more traditional and less visible role within the royal family. Some advisors think it would be safer and would prevent future attacks." James felt his heart sink at the implications of her words. If Princess Catherine withdrew from public life, the conspiracy would have achieved its goals even though its operational execution had failed. The people who wanted to eliminate her influence would have won through intimidation what they couldn't accomplish through violence. "What are you thinking about doing?" James asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral despite his strong feelings about the choice she was facing. "I'm thinking about refusing the offer and continuing my work exactly as I was doing it before the attack," Princess Catherine replied with a smile that reminded James why he had been so impressed by her courage during their ordeal. "I'm thinking that if I change my behavior because of threats and violence, then the people who tried to kill us will have won a different kind of victory." James felt a surge of pride and relief at her words. This was the woman he had risked his life to protect. Someone who understood that backing down in the face of threats would betray not just her own principles, but all the people who depended on her advocacy and leadership.
"Ma'am, if you make that choice, you need to understand that the threats against you probably haven't ended," James said seriously.
"The people we arrested were the operational level of the conspiracy, but we haven't identified all the individuals who might have been involved in planning or financing the operation. There could be others who see your continued independence as an ongoing threat." "I understand that," Princess Catherine replied. "That's why I wanted to ask you something. I've been offered the opportunity to choose my own head of security for a new protection unit that would report directly to Colonel Hayes rather than through normal royal household channels. James, I want to offer you that position if you're interested." James felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Accepting the position would mean taking responsibility not just for Princess Catherine's physical safety, but for protecting her ability to continue the work that made her such an effective and influential member of the royal family. It would mean dedicating his life to ensuring that courage and integrity could triumph over fear and intimidation. "Ma'am, it would be an honor to continue serving as your protection officer," James replied. "But I want you to understand what accepting that role means for me personally. After what we went through together, protecting you isn't just a professional duty anymore. It's personal. If anyone tries to harm you again, I won't hesitate to do whatever is necessary to stop them, regardless of their position or authority." Princess Catherine looked at him with an expression that combined gratitude, understanding, and something that looked like genuine friendship. "James, I wouldn't want anyone else watching my back. We make a good team." As they continued their walk through the park, James reflected on how completely his understanding of duty and service had evolved. 3 months ago, he had defined his role in terms of following protocols and maintaining proper distances. Now he understood that true service sometimes required breaking protocols and making personal commitments that went beyond professional obligations. The conspiracy had failed in its immediate objective of eliminating Princess Catherine, but it had succeeded in one unintended way. It had forged a partnership between a royal and her protector that was based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than simple hierarchy and protocol. That partnership would prove to be far more effective than any conventional security arrangement in protecting not just Princess Catherine's life, but her ability to continue making a positive difference in the world. 6 months later, James stood in his new office in a secure facility that officially didn't exist, reviewing intelligence reports and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Europe to track down the remaining elements of the conspiracy. His title was now Director of Special Protection Services, and his mandate was to ensure that no member of the royal family would ever again face the kind of internal betrayal that had nearly cost Princess Catherine her life. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that his previous role had never been. Instead of simply reacting to threats, he was now actively working to prevent them. Instead of following protocols designed by others, he was creating new security paradigms based on his hard-won understanding of how modern threats evolved and operated. Princess Catherine had not only continued her charitable work, but had expanded it significantly, using her experience with the conspiracy to advocate for greater transparency and accountability in government operations. Her speeches about the importance of public service and institutional integrity carried special weight because everyone knew she had nearly died defending those principles. The attack that had begun with James placing his hand on his blade to protect Princess Catherine had ultimately strengthened both of them in ways they could never have anticipated. It had revealed their true character under extreme pressure and had created a partnership that would continue to serve the crown and the British people for years to come. James often thought about that moment in the palace corridor when he had first sensed danger and prepared to fight for Princess Catherine's life. At the time, it had seemed like a simple professional response to a perceived threat. Now he understood that it had been the beginning of something much more significant, a transformation of duty into dedication, of service into partnership, and of protection into a sacred trust that would define the rest of his life. The blade that he had drawn to protect her had become a symbol not just of his willingness to fight for her safety, but of his commitment to ensuring that courage and integrity could survive in a world where powerful people were willing to use violence to maintain their control. That commitment had been tested in the crucible of mortal danger, and it had emerged stronger and more focused than ever before. As he prepared for another day of protecting someone who had proven herself worthy of protection, James Mitchell knew that he had found his true calling. The quiet guardian had become something more, a warrior for justice, a defender of virtue, and a man who understood that the highest form of service was the willingness to risk everything for people who embodied the best of human nature. The story that had begun with a hand on a blade had become a testament to the power of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that could form between people who faced mortal danger together and emerged with their integrity intact. It was a story that would never be fully told in public, but it would continue to influence events and protect lives for generations to come.